Hello and welcome back to Fatboss TV. Today we're back with more Shadowlands beta raid testing, and we're here to show you the last boss in Castle Nathria, Sire Denathrius.
Yes, this is a 3-phase fight and it looks to be one of the best ones in the instance. There's a bunch of interesting challenges and mechanical puzzles to work out in this fight, and in a Black Hand style transition it takes place across 2 rooms. Now a quick note before we start, although we didn't get to see much of phase 3, we did get a good idea of roughly what's going on, so whilst we don't have too much to show you, we can still comment on it. Anyway, there is a lot going on in this fight, so let's start off with phase 1.
First off, the simple mechanics. For tanks, the boss has an ability which stops you from kiting him. He will just simply snap to your position if you're a decent distance away from him. This isn't all too important or noticeable in phase 1, but in phase 2 you'll definitely notice it. As for the raid, 2 people will be frequently marked by ghostly images. The marked players will have a circle around them and a line that leads to them. After 6 seconds, the image will charge along the line and hit the player, dealing almost lethal damage to that player and anyone within their circle, whilst also healing the boss. Other players can reduce this damage by standing within the line to the player. You do, however, need to be careful because soaking 2 lines at the same time will just flat out one-shot you. So simply have the lines separated and make sure that a decent amount of people soak each line. Meanwhile, the marked player needs to make sure that no one else is within their circle because you'll want to reduce the amount of healing the boss gains. You can also immune this ability, so no one needs to soak your line whatsoever. Each time the boss reaches 100% energy, the blade in the middle of the room will cast a huge frontal cone covering a third of the room. This deals crazy high damage if you're caught and leaves goo on the floor that makes you healing immune, whilst also doing nasty ticking damage. After each hit, the boss will gain a 10% damage increase that stacks until the end of the phase. The first hit seems to be faced towards the boss, but the second and third hit will never overlap with previous hits, meaning the room will be completely covered after the third hit. This acts as an enrage, so you've got to get out of this phase by getting the boss to 70% health before the third cast goes off.
Okay, on to the more technical part of phase 1. At the beginning of the fight, the entire raid gains 5 stacks of the Burden of Sin debuff. This Sin debuff is just a simple permanent dot, but it interacts with a couple of the other boss mechanics. One of these interactions happens with Blood Price. The boss will pick everyone up, deal some damage to them, and then throw them away. Now the amount of damage you take depends on how many people have the same amount of Burden of Sin stacks as you. The more players that have the same amount of stacks, the more damage all of those people are going to take. So you want the raid to have as many different stack amounts as possible just to reduce the incoming damage of this ability. Now the only way you can remove your sin stacks is by standing in the boss's Cleansing Sin frontal cone, always aimed towards the current tank. If you stand in this, you'll take some damage, lose 1 sin stack, and spawn an ad. This ad is immune to CC and just deals pulsing damage to the raid. To spawn these ads close together, we kept the boss close to the wall and have all soaking players stand nearby. As soon as they spawn, make sure you quickly kill them, especially as the Blood Price cast isn't usually far behind. Now you have a total of 6 of these frontal hits before the boss needs to transition, leaving you with a ton of different options when it comes to who clears the stacks when and how often. As a simple rule of thumb, we recommend that you split the raid into 2 halves. Have one half take the odd numbered hits, and the other half take the even numbered hits. As the boss always casts Blood Price after each odd numbered hit, you'd always have half the raid with different stacks to the other half. In extra large raid sizes, it seems that you'll want to probably complicate this process further by having a portion of your raid take more hits as to reduce the Blood Price damage even more, but this will increase the number of ads that you have to deal with, which might make things difficult. In the description of this video, we've linked to a Google Doc for those who are interested in working on ways of min-maxing who is hit at which point, which might be useful for live, but we hope you can just do the half and half strat. Now the other mechanic that interacts with the Burden of Sin stacks is the intermission. When the boss does reach 70% health, he will pick up all players and throw them to the edges of the room. Each player cannot use their abilities and is slowed by 20% for each sin stack they have. The objective is just to get to the middle of the room before his cast ends. Getting close to him removes all of your sin stacks and allows you to survive the intermission. You need to have a maximum of 2 Burden of Sin stacks to allow you to have enough speed to reach the boss, perhaps 3 at a push. However, we discovered that some classes, such as a Shaman in Ghostwolf before the transition begins, or a DK who has Death's Advance talented, can cheese this entirely, allowing them to have 5 stacks and still move to the center properly. Priests can also life grip players after the priest has cleansed their stacks because you can use abilities at that point. So with this in mind, you can actually further reduce the amount of ads spawned during phase 1, as well as reducing blood price damage by having those DKs and shamans not soak at any point, plus one additional person per priest who is assigned a life grip to survive the phase. We're not sure if this is intended or necessary, nor did we test every single other movement immunity possible, but it might be something important to note for live. Regardless, everyone that made it to the middle and got their stacks removed will be dragged down into the final room where phases 2 and 3 take place. If you did have stacks, you will be dragged down, but you'll instantly die.
Throughout phase 2, the boss is accompanied by a massive sword. This needs to be tanked and will apply hard-hitting bleeds to the tank, forcing them to taunt swap around the 3 to 4 stack mark. As the tank damage in this phase is particularly high, you want to make sure that you only ever have the sword on you or the boss, so taunt so that's always the case. DPS in this phase you'll want to be primarily focusing down Denathrius, however the damage you deal to the sword is also done to him, so if you can cleave extra damage onto the sword, you should do. Aside from the tank bleed, the sword will also occasionally mark 3 players before jumping to them each in turn, dealing damage and leaving goo on the ground for each person it hits along the way. We felt the best way of doing this was having unmarked players move towards melee away from the sword, whilst the marked players move towards the edges to place the goo in low traffic areas. When Denathrius reaches 100% energy, the sword will cast Massacre, sending a bunch of lines across the platform. You need to just simply sidestep these lines, which can be made easier by loosely spreading as it does target your position. If you're hit by these, chances are you are just going to die, but to make matters worse, you're also going to leave a patch of goo on the ground. Another thing to deal with in this phase is the Kabbalist ads. These will spawn on one side of the encounter space, 2 on the main platform, and 1 on either side. These ads simply deal ticking damage to the raid, which isn't too high, but if you don't kill them, you are going to fall behind in the long run, and on top of that you need them all dead before phase 3 begins. To kill these ads quicker, you can use the boss's frontal cone ability called Racking Pain. It deals a big burst of damage and leaves a 50% damage taken increase on all players and ads hit. So if you position the boss correctly, you can hit the 2 center ads and a platform ad whilst all other players avoid it. Killing the ads on the platform is a little bit more tricky than those in the main area, as some classes cannot jump over the gap. We instead recommend that all ranged DPS swap to them, and if this isn't enough, you'll want to send over the melee DPS who have teleports, leaps or shadow steps. You can also use gateways to assist them. One last note for these ads is that when they die, they will throw out some swirlies underneath players, much like the N'Zoth tentacles, so make sure you dodge them, as they will knock you back, and you don't want to fall off the platform to your death. A new boss ability to deal with in this phase is the Hand of Destruction. This creates an image at the boss's position, and drags all players into it. 6 seconds later, it deals high damage to the entire raid that falls off with distance. You can just simply run against this, but there is a better way. At the end of each of the main paths in the room is a red mirror. Running into this mirror will instantly teleport you to the mirror on the opposite side. We decided to tank the boss near the mirror, so we can just jump through at any point just to reduce the damage from the Hand of Destruction. What's nice is that this doesn't even lose too much melee uptime, as both the boss and the sword will teleport to the tanks as soon as they're out of range. You can also use this mirror to jump back to where you just came from, which can be very useful if there are still ads up. And that wraps up phase 2. It's just a cycle of killing ads and using the mirrors to dodge the Hand of Destruction. And this continues until the boss reaches a 40% health, at which point phase 3 begins. If there are any ads up at this point, they would leap towards the middle of the room, whilst each reducing the incoming healing on the raid by 15%, and this will stack. So you need to make sure that you kill them all before this point, or if you do have any up, you need to swap to them immediately, just so you're clean going into phase 3.
Now we don't have any footage of phase 3 to show you unfortunately, so let's talk about it from a map perspective. The boss will immediately surround the room with indignation goo, disabling all of the mirrors and dealing very high ticking damage to anyone stood within it, so you want to try and transition whilst everyone is near the middle of the room. The boss will now wield the sword, despawning it as an attackable enemy. This just gives the boss's melee attacks a dot, which tanks will need to taunt swap to allow to drop. The boss will keep his Hand of Destruction ability, but you no longer have access to the mirrors to move from it. You should keep him near the edge of the platform so players can move as far as they can to reduce the damage they take from it. This is probably going to be a good time for group movement speeds and gateways. Now the boss has a few brand new abilities for this phase. Fatal Finesse debuffs are placed on a few players. After they expire, they just do a little bit of splash damage and spawn an orb. This orb will explode after 10 seconds, but you can reduce the damage this does by standing within it and soaking it up, just like an arcane orb that you've seen on loads of different fights. We recommend that each debuff is dropped relatively close to the raid so that people don't have to move too much to reach the orb once it spawns. Just make sure you're not splashing on anyone as you're spawning it. Another ability is Shattering Pain, which is 3 individual tank hits followed by an unavoidable raid hit, which knocks players away from the boss. You want to make sure that you are close to him and that you're positioned in a way that you are knocked into the room, not into any of the goo or off the platform. Lastly, when the boss reaches 100% energy, he will spawn an image ad. This ad will either cast Ravage, the huge frontal from phase 1 which covers 1/3 of the room in goo, or Massacre, the move that will spawn a shit ton of swords. This is pretty much the Enrage. You need to kill the boss before Ravage is cast 3 times and the room is completely coated in goo. Also, you've got to take into account that the play space is getting smaller. You're going to have to be really careful how you deal with the knockbacks as well as the dragons, as you'll want to avoid the Ravage goo as much as you possibly can. But that's the fight. It is looking really, really cool.